The applause was still echoing through the vineyard's grand tasting hall when my mother raised her champagne glass and smiled at a group of investors. "We've always known Elena would do something extraordinary," she said proudly. "She's always had our support." I stood frozen beside my 3 teenage children. My son Noah leaned toward me and whispered, "Mom, who is that?" I looked at him for a long second before answering, "That's your grandmother." His eyebrows lifted. "The one we've never met." Before I could answer, my father stepped between 2 guests and shook hands with the CEO, who had just finalized the purchase of our family vineyard for $120 million. "I'm Richard Brooks," he announced with effortless confidence, "her father." He said it like those 2 words erased 15 years of silence. Around the room, people smiled politely, assuming they were watching a joyful family reunion. Only my children noticed the way my hands tightened around the folder I was carrying. Inside were 2 envelopes. One contained the legal documents everyone expected. The other contained something no one in that room, not even my parents, could have imagined. When the host invited me to the podium to celebrate the sale, I didn't begin with a thank you. Instead, I stepped to the microphone and quietly said, "Before anyone celebrates today, there's something everyone here deserves to know." The applause disappeared. Every conversation stopped. And for the first time since my parents had walked back into my life, they looked uncertain. 15 years earlier, they had turned their backs on me without hesitation. Now they had returned just in time to watch me become wealthy. They wore expensive clothes, smiled for photographs, and greeted business partners as though they had helped build everything surrounding us. None of the investors knew the truth. None of the reporters knew why my triplets had stared at these 2 strangers with confusion instead of affection. To everyone else, Richard and Diane Brooks looked like proud grandparents celebrating their daughter's success. Only I knew that when my husband died, they had disappeared from our lives almost overnight. Only I knew who had actually stayed. Across the room sat my late husband's parents, Margaret and Thomas. They hadn't tried to draw attention to themselves. Margaret quietly held Noah's jacket over the back of her chair the same way she always had. Thomas smiled at my daughters, Emma and Lily, who instinctively stood beside him instead of beside my biological parents. That single image told a story no photograph ever could. Near my podium rested a leather portfolio prepared by my attorney. Beside it was a second envelope that nobody had been told about, not the investors, not the employees, and certainly not my parents, who seemed convinced they had arrived just in time to reclaim a place in my life. My mother gave me an encouraging smile from the front row. It was the same smile she used whenever she wanted something. I returned it with a calm expression, opened the first folder, looked around the silent room and took a slow breath. Then I said, "To understand what happens today, you first have to understand what happened the week after my husband died." After the funeral, the silence in our house felt heavier than the grief. 3 bassinets stood in the living room. 3 newborn Barbies cried at different moments, each needing something different. And every time I looked toward the empty chair where my husband used to sit, reality hit me all over again. The vineyard still needed tending. Invoices kept arriving. Employees wanted to know what came next. I barely had enough energy to remember whether I had eaten that day. One afternoon, after another sleepless night, I buckled Noah, Emma, and Lily into their car seats and drove to my parents' house. I wasn't asking for money. I wasn't asking them to raise my children. I just needed help for a little while. My mother answered the door. She looked past me at the Barbies before crossing her arms. "What happened?" "I need your help," I said quietly. "Just for a few months. I have to keep the vineyard running and I can't do everything alone." She frowned. "You should sell it." "I'm not asking about the vineyard. You should have sold it the moment Daniel passed away." Before I could respond, my father appeared in the hallway. He didn't invite me inside. Instead, he asked, "Why are you making this harder than it has to be?" "I'm trying to keep Daniel's dream alive." He shook his head. "No, you're being stubborn." The Barbies began crying almost together. I bounced one carrier gently while trying to keep my voice steady. I only need someone to watch them while I work. My mother's expression never softened. You made your choices, Elena. I stared at her. My husband just died. And now you're a mother, figure it out. The words landed harder than I expected. For a moment, I honestly thought she would change her mind. Instead, she reached for the doorknob. We can't put our lives on hold because of your decisions. The front door closed. I stood on the porch holding one carrier, while the other two Barbies cried behind me in the stroller. No one opened the door again. I loaded the triplets back into the car without saying a word. Halfway home, I pulled into an empty parking lot because I couldn't see through the tears. There was only one phone number left to call. My father-in-law answered on the second ring. Elena. I'm sorry, I whispered. I don't know who else to ask. He didn't interrupt. I can't keep up with the Barbies and the vineyard. I don't know what to do anymore. There was only a brief pause. Then he said, "Where are you?" I told him. We're coming. Less than 40 minutes later, Thomas and Margaret pulled into the parking lot. Margaret climbed out first. Without asking a single question, she picked up Emma and gently rocked her until she stopped crying. Thomas opened my driver's door. Come home with us. I don't want to burden you. He smiled sadly. Your family. They packed their own spare bedrooms within days. A guest room became a nursery. Thomas converted his small workshop into storage for strollers, cribs, and supplies. Margaret rewrote her entire routine around midnight feedings, doctor's appointments, and laundry. Neither of them complained. Weeks passed. I started spending mornings at the vineyard while they cared for the Barbies. Every afternoon I hurried back to relieve them, but somehow dinner was always waiting. One evening I noticed Thomas's vintage fishing boat was gone. I thought you loved that boat, I said. He shrugged. We needed cash for repairs on the irrigation system. A month later, Margaret's jewelry box looked strangely empty. She caught me looking. Oh, she said with a smile. Those old pieces weren't doing anyone any good. I knew exactly what had happened. Little by little, they were selling the things they'd spent a lifetime collecting. Not because anyone asked them to. Because they refused to let Daniel's children lose their home. Standing alone in the vineyard one evening, I looked across the rows of vines glowing in the setting sun. I made myself a promise. No matter how long it took, no matter how hard the road became, I would never forget who stood beside me when everyone else walked away. As if he could hear the promise forming in my mind, Thomas rested a hand on my shoulder and looked across the vineyard. One day, he said quietly, this vineyard will stand again, but only if we stand together first. The first news report appeared on a Tuesday morning. Historic family vineyard sold for $120 million. By lunchtime, every local business owner was talking about it. Employees hugged each other in the winery. Neighbors stopped by to congratulate us. Reporters wanted interviews about how a struggling family vineyard had become one of the region's most valuable estates. When they asked who had made it possible, everyone gave the same answer. Elena and her husband's parents. No one mentioned Richard or Diane Brooks, because no one had seen them in years. Then almost overnight they reappeared. An aunt called me first. Your parents told everyone they've been helping you behind the scenes. I frowned. What? They said they stayed out of the spotlight because they wanted you to receive all the credit. Before I could process that, my phone buzzed again. A cousin had sent screenshots from social media. My parents had uploaded old family photos from long before my husband died. The captions painted an entirely different story. So proud of our daughter. Family has always been our greatest investment. Watching years of hard work finally pay off. People who didn't know the truth flooded the comments with congratulations. "What an incredible family. You must be so proud." I stared at the screen in disbelief. They weren't just reconnecting. They were rewriting history. A week later, we attended a charity fundraiser hosted by the local Chamber of Commerce. Business leaders, vineyard owners, and community members filled the ballroom. I had barely stepped inside with Noah, Emma, and Lily when my mother spotted us. "There they are," she called loudly. Before I could react, she wrapped her arms around me. Cameras flashed. Photographers assumed they were capturing a touching family reunion. My father reached for Noah's shoulder. "Our grandson has grown so much." Noah instinctively stepped backward. He looked toward Thomas instead. The movement was small, but I noticed it. So did several people standing nearby. My mother laughed awkwardly. "Teenagers," she said to the photographers, "they're always shy." Emma quietly moved beside Margaret. Lily took Thomas's arm. Neither girl acknowledged Richard or Diane. The contrast couldn't have been clearer. Still, I refused to embarrass anyone publicly. "Excuse us," I said politely. "We're expected at another table." My father leaned closer before I could walk away. "We should all have dinner soon." "I'll let you know," I answered evenly. It wasn't a promise. It was an exit. Later that evening, while guests mingled between speeches, Miguel, one of our longest-serving vineyard managers, approached me. "Can we talk privately?" We stepped into the hallway. He lowered his voice. "I probably shouldn't mention this." "What is it?" "I overheard your parents." My stomach tightened. "They've been asking around." "Asking what?" "They wanted to know whether adult children are legally required to share proceeds after selling a family business." I blinked. "They spoke with attorneys." He nodded. "They weren't asking about reconciliation. They were asking about entitlement." For a moment, everything became painfully clear. The phone calls, the photographs, the hugs, the interviews. None of it had been about rebuilding a relationship. It had been about $120 million. When I returned home that night, I unlocked an old storage cabinet in my office. Inside sat folders I hadn't opened in years. Emails, letters, financial records, messages I had never wanted to read again. I began searching through them one by one. The first email was exactly as I remembered. Subject: "Need help for a few weeks." My request had been simple. "I don't need money. I only need someone to help with the Barbies while I keep the vineyard running." My mother's reply came less than an hour later. "Sell the vineyard. We are not rearranging our lives because you refuse to accept reality." I kept reading. Another request months later. Another refusal. Then another. Each message carried the same answer in different words. No childcare. No temporary housing. No emergency help. No visits. No support. This hadn't been one painful conversation. It had been a pattern. Years of deliberate choices. I closed the final folder and picked up my phone. "My parents-in-law gave everything to save this family," I told my attorney. "I need the paperwork changed." There was a brief pause. "Changed how?" I looked toward the living room, where Thomas was helping Noah with homework while Margaret laughed with Emma and Lily over a board game. Then I answered with complete certainty. "Prepare an entirely new set of documents for the sale ceremony." The morning of the public announcement arrived with more attention than I had expected. Local officials, winery employees, longtime neighbors, investors, and members of the press gathered beneath a white tent overlooking the vineyard. Tables were decorated with bottles from our final vintage, each one representing years of work that had almost been lost. My attorney met me before the guests began taking their seats. Everything is ready, she said, handing me 2 leather folders. I nodded. Thank you. She studied my face for a moment. Are you sure you want to do this publicly? I've spent years staying quiet, I replied. Today everyone deserves the truth. She didn't argue. Instead, she handed me one final page to review. I slipped both folders under my arm and walked toward the house. Before joining the crowd, I stopped in Daniel's old office. Boxes of financial records still lined one wall. I opened the file Thomas had insisted I keep. Inside were mortgage documents, property refinance agreements, cancelled retirement investment statements, receipts for irrigation repairs, equipment purchases, and payroll advances. Every page told the same story. When the vineyard couldn't pay its bills, Thomas and Margaret had found a way. They had refinanced part of their own property. They had postponed retirement. They had emptied savings they had spent decades building. Not once had they asked to be repaid. Not once had they requested ownership. The only note Thomas had ever attached to one of the transfers read, "Keep the workers employed, we'll figure the rest out later." I closed the folder slowly. Then I opened another. It contained the emails from my parents. There they were again. Every request I had made. Every refusal they had given. When I had asked for childcare. When I had asked for temporary housing. When I had asked whether they could simply stay with the Barbies for one afternoon during harvest. Each answer was unmistakable. No. Sell the vineyard. This isn't our responsibility. The contrast between the two families couldn't have been clearer. One had quietly sacrificed everything. The other had repeatedly chosen distance. Outside, I could hear guests arriving. As I stepped onto the patio, snippets of conversation floated through the air. I heard Elena has another announcement. They say she's doing something special for the family. I wonder how she's dividing the proceeds. The rumors spread faster than I expected. By the time the ceremony was ready to begin, people were openly speculating. Across the lawn, my parents stood together greeting guests with easy smiles. My father laughed with a local businessman. I've always said Elena inherited her determination from me. My mother nodded enthusiastically. It's wonderful seeing everything come full circle. Neither of them noticed Thomas quietly helping employees arrange extra chairs for elderly guests. Margaret was making sure the catering staff had enough water available in the summer heat. They behaved exactly as they always had. Helping, never asking to be noticed. My 3 children walked toward me together. Without hesitation, Noah stopped beside Thomas. Emma slipped her arm through Margaret's. Lily smiled at me before taking her place with them. None of them moved toward Richard or Diane. Several guests exchanged curious glances. One whispered, "I thought those were her parents." Another answered softly, "Those are the grandparents who raised the kids." The distinction spread through the crowd without another word. My father finally seemed to notice. His smile tightened. He straightened his jacket and walked confidently toward the front row anyway. I watched him take his seat beside my mother. They looked completely at ease. Almost expectant. As though they were waiting for recognition they believed was overdue. The host welcomed everyone, thanked the employees, and announced the successful completion of the $120 million sale. Applause rolled across the vineyard. Then my name was called. Carrying both leather folders, I walked to the podium. The microphones amplified every footstep across the wooden stage. I placed the folders on the podium. The crowd settled into silence. My parents smiled up at me. My father gave a small approving nod. I met his eyes for a brief moment. Then I opened the first folder, looked across the audience and began reading the opening line. At that exact moment, the entire gathering fell silent. I looked across the audience before speaking. Thank you all for being here today. A few people smiled and nodded. This vineyard represents more than a business. To many people, it represents perseverance. But before I talk about its future, I need to talk about its past. The room grew still. 15 years ago, my husband Daniel passed away. I was left with 3 newborn Barbies, a struggling vineyard, and no idea how I was going to keep either one alive. I paused. I asked my parents for help. Richard shifted in his seat. Diane's smile faded. I didn't ask them for money. I didn't ask them to take over the vineyard. I asked for temporary childcare so I could keep working long enough to save my family's livelihood. I lifted several printed emails from the folder. I kept every message. The first page rustled softly as I held it up. My email read, "I only need help for a few weeks while I get through harvest." I lowered my eyes to the response. My mother's reply was, "Sell the vineyard. We are not rearranging our lives because you refuse to accept reality." A murmur spread through the crowd. I picked up another page. Months later I asked again. The answer was no. Another page. When I needed emergency help, the answer was no. Another. When I simply asked if someone could watch the Barbies for one afternoon, the answer was still no. I looked back at the audience. I never asked them to build my future. I only asked them to help me survive one of the darkest moments of my life. Silence settled over the vineyard. No one applauded. No one interrupted. The words spoke for themselves. Then I turned toward Thomas and Margaret. When I made the same phone call to my husband's parents, they never asked how much it would cost. Margaret lowered her eyes. Thomas folded his hands together. They simply said, "Come home." I smiled at them. They opened their house to me and 3 newborn Barbies. They turned bedrooms into a nursery. They changed their entire lives without asking for anything in return. I picked up another folder. Later, when the vineyard was close to failing, they refinanced their own property. I held up the documents. They postponed retirement. Another page. They sold personal belongings. Another. They invested their savings to keep employees working. I looked around the audience. Not one of those sacrifices came with a request for ownership. Several longtime employees quietly nodded. One wiped away a tear. They believed in this vineyard because they believed in family. I took a slow breath. So today, I have the privilege of recognizing the people who actually made this success possible. I opened the second leather folder. My attorney has prepared documents transferring the family home into Thomas and Margaret's names. Margaret covered her mouth. Thomas stared at me in disbelief. In addition, a trust has been established to provide them with complete financial security for the rest of their lives. Neither of them moved. They simply looked at each other, overwhelmed. I've also created education and future trusts for Noah, Emma, and Lily. My children smiled through tears. And every employee who stayed through the difficult years will receive a bonus in recognition of their loyalty. Applause began softly. Then it spread across the entire audience. I raised my hand for one final moment. This isn't repayment. The applause faded again. No amount of money could repay what they gave us. I looked directly at Thomas and Margaret. This is acknowledgement. Margaret finally stood and embraced me. "We never expected any of this," she whispered. "You already gave me everything," I replied. "I'm just making sure everyone else knows it." From the front row came an unsteady voice. "What about us?" My parents were standing now. My father looked stunned. My mother's eyes were fixed on the unopened space, where she had apparently expected her own envelope. "We're your family," she said. I met her gaze calmly. "I agree." She seemed relieved for a fraction of a second. Then I continued. "Family is the people who stay when your life falls apart, not the people who return after it comes back together." No one spoke. My father glanced around the crowd, searching for support. Instead, several longtime neighbors quietly nodded. One of our oldest vineyard workers stood. I remember Thomas fixing irrigation lines at midnight. Another added, Margaret brought meals to the crews every harvest. A retired accountant spoke next. I handled the refinancing paperwork. Those two risked their retirement to keep this place alive. The room filled with quiet confirmations. Not accusations. Not insults. Just memories. Each one reinforced the same truth. Richard and Diane had no answer. The timeline, the documents, and the witnesses all pointed in one direction. After a long silence, my father lowered his head. Without another word, he and my mother walked toward the exit. No one followed them. No one stopped them. When they reached the parking area, they left exactly as they had chosen to live for the past 15 years, apart from us. The celebration slowly resumed, but it felt different now. Lighter. Honest. Employees congratulated Thomas and Margaret. Friends embraced them. The investors who had come to celebrate a successful sale ended up witnessing something much more meaningful. My children never left their grandparents' side. Watching them together, I realized they had never wondered who their real grandparents were. They had known all along. In the months that followed, Thomas and Margaret finally retired without worrying about another mortgage payment or another harvest season. The employee bonuses helped several families buy homes, pay off debts, and send children to college. Noah, Emma, and Lily began planning their futures, knowing they had security their father would have wanted them to have. As for me, I invested part of the remaining proceeds into new agricultural ventures and community projects, carrying forward the values that had saved our family in the first place. I never heard from my parents again. For the first time in my life, their silence no longer hurt. Because I had stopped waiting for love from people who had chosen not to give it. Standing on the hill overlooking the vineyard one last time, I watched Thomas and Margaret laughing with my children beneath the evening sun. The vineyard had been sold, but the family that built its legacy was still together. The day my parents came expecting a fortune was the day everyone learned who had truly earned it.